He's going to come and share with you some biblical principles that he lives his life by, and he runs his business by these principles. He's a wonderful, wonderful man, great part of our Shoreline family. Please welcome Wes Young.
Thank you. Great. Well, it's just a joy to be with you. I always enjoy this time and getting to meet such incredible people who are just trying to get out there and make some progress, right? I have a question for you. I do want a little bit of response, so if you could just play along with me. How many of you would like to be rich? All right. Now, those of you who didn't raise your hand, next month we're going to have one on honesty. We're going to be talking about liars. And so you'll have to come back for that. But you know what's interesting is that the word being rich, right? The word rich itself. Anytime we say that in sometimes a church setting or with God in the mix, we can get a little bit weird, can't we? I mean, can't we? And so I had a friend of mine, in fact, when he found out I was writing the book From Busy to Rich, he said, you know, Wes, I don't know if you ought to call it that. He said, that might, throw people off. He said, because, money, it's not the key to happiness. And I just messed with him a little bit. I said, yeah, but, you make enough money, you can have a key made. And so in all honesty, you know what? There's a kind of rich that you and I can be where you don't have to choose between happy and rich. You can have both. In fact, in the Word of God in Proverbs 10:22, it says, the blessings of the Lord make one rich, and he adds no sorrow to it. That's good. And that's the kind of rich I want to talk to you a little bit about today. I want to talk to you about that. Now, I think in order to do a good job of that, the thing we want to do is I want to help you understand what I think most people think of, and I don't think they say this outwardly, but I think subconsciously, internally, the definition of rich that they're pursuing is a little bit different from what God had in mind. And so I want to unpack that for you, talk a little bit about what that's like, and then we'll get on to maybe more God's intent for that. So I want to do that by telling you a story. How many of you know where Odessa, Texas is? All right. I'm in company of Texans here, so that's a good thing. Depending on where you speak, some people don't know until you talk about Friday Night Lights or football, and then all of a sudden they know. I grew up in Odessa, Texas. Now, what's interesting about that is I like to fish. And if you grow up in Odessa, Texas, and you like to fish, you got a problem, right? There is no water anywhere around there. I mean, you have to drive roughly 3 hours to get to the closest lake to do it. And that's what we used to do growing up. Me and my dad, we would do it. Now, one time my dad couldn't go with me. And so I enlisted the help of my sister, who was about 5 years older than I was. I was about 15 years old at the time. And my brother-in-law, he was her boyfriend at the time. So we loaded up in my mom's red Ford Probe. Anybody remember those? We were armed with the latest in GPS technology, which was an atlas from State Farm, right? I love the atlas because Texas took up like 4 pages in there. It was incredible, right? So it was so much fun. And so we headed out, and now we went to a town called Big Lake, Texas. Okay, that's where we decided we were going to go. And outside of the town of Big Lake, on this atlas was this big lake. Ironically, it was called Big Lake, right? So we headed there. About 3 hours later, we're in the town. We take the road that's going to lead us to the lake. And so you know how it is, like we estimated that it was probably about 5 miles outside of the town. And how it is when we've gone a long way and you're really excited to get there, and how you have that eager anticipation of this glistening lake that's going to appear over the horizon. And we started hitting the hills, and we reached about mile 5. And so we were really excited about what was going to be on the other side of the hill, and oh, no lake. And so we go down into another valley, but it's going to be building there, and there's going to be this glistening lake, and oh, no lake. Now, somewhere in between mile 5 and 10, okay, the eager anticipation turned into confusion, okay? And then somewhere between mile 10 and 15, it turned into frustration. Ended with my brother-in-law, boyfriend at the time, pulled over the side of the road, grabbing the atlas from me, and we had a little relational adjustment session because it was everybody else's fault as to why we got there. And we did what guys do when they're lost. We drove around for about 45 more minutes trying to find the lake, right? And so inevitably, we end up back in the town of Big Lake, okay? And my brother-in-law goes into the gas station to ask the attendant, how do we get to this lake? And when he came back out, he said something none of us ever imagined. Doesn't exist. Excuse me? He said, lake doesn't exist. I said, it's right here on the atlas. He said, apparently, the atlas is old. Lake doesn't exist. He said, we've been searching for a destination that doesn't exist. And you know what? We crack up about that now. At the time, it was not funny at all. But at Thanksgiving and Christmas and holidays. But you know what? There's a reality in that moment, in that experience, that I think translates over to wealth and being rich. Is that when it comes to being rich, I believe the majority of the world is pursuing a destination that doesn't exist. And here's what that is. Gallup Poll Organization did a study. Okay, they had over 11,000 people involved in this study, varying different economic degrees. Okay, so people who were just starting out and people who made a whole lot. And they asked them one question. And the question was, what does it take to be rich? Now, at first, the answers appeared to be all over the map because they went to the people who made $30,000 a year and less, and they all had a pretty even-keeled answer. They said, to be rich, you need an annual income of $74,000 a year. Now, what's interesting is those of you who make $74,000 a year are going, hey, I might not know what rich is, but it ain't that, right? You're going, I know what it's not, and it's not $74,000 a year. Now, they went on up the income ladder there. They had people that made between $50,000 and $75,000, ask them the same question. They said, it's not $74,000, it's $120,000, right? If I had $120,000 of annual income, then I'd be rich. And if you've made $120,000 a year, that ain't rich. And it just kept going and going and going. And while the answers, though the numbers were different, the answers were always the same. Because no matter how high they went, the people always said they wanted about double what they were making now and they'd be rich. And the real answer that they all gave was, I just need more than I currently have. Because the real definition that most people are pursuing, I believe it unconsciously when it comes to being rich, is to be rich, they need to arrive at the place where they finally have more money than they have ideas, right? Where they have outrun or out-earned all their ideas. Now, there's a big problem with that way of thinking. Because you and I, everyone in this room, we have a gap. Okay, we have a gap between where we are and where we want to be. We have a gap between what I see today and what could be tomorrow. Okay, and I believe entrepreneurs, and most of you in this room, you have it to the 10th degree, right? I mean, we have this gap between where we are, where we want to be, and that gap never goes away. It just moves. It just matures. And that ought to really perk you up, because you know what that is? That's the thumbprint of God on you and the thumbprint of God on me. Because without a gap, we have no opportunity to engage in the fundamentals of faith. Faith in Hebrews 11:1 says it's the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not yet seen. Without faith, it says it's impossible to please God. But we were designed and built to live in this faith gap between where we are and where we think's better. Now, the other side of that is we can certainly take better to a degree that God had no intention, right? We can all pursue something I want that's not on God's list of things that he would have designed for our life. But in its original intent, all of us are designed to have this gap between where we are and where we want to be. And that gap's never going to go away. It's just going to move. And so if your definition of rich means I'm finally going to have out-earned or outrun all my ideas, not only is that a bad definition, it's an impossible one to achieve. It's like hooking up your boat and going to Big Lake to go fish. Just never going to happen. And I want to give you some examples of this because I really want this to sink in, okay? Think back with me to your first job, okay? Now, some of you, that wasn't that long ago. Some of you who I know, that was a long time ago. But think way back to that first job. And I remember mine. I was at a video store. Okay, they actually had videos, VHS videos back then. And my job was to put the tapes back on the shelf. That's what I did. And I made $4.25 an hour. And I had this thought that occurred to me when I was 15 and making $4.25 an hour. And I'll bet if you're honest, somewhere in your first year of work it happened to you too. I said, you know what? When I'm making another dollar, I'm going to be rich, right? I mean, I'm going to have all this extra money. And the reason was I had a 15-year-old gap, right? Between where I was and where I wanted to be. And another $1 an hour would solve my gap. I mean, I could get everything on my list and then have a little bit of extra time and extra money to spare. Interestingly, you would also look at those people that were a couple income levels above you, and you go, how do these people have financial problems, right? They ought to be throwing a party. They make so much more than I do. And what's interesting is years later, the same thing happened to you as it did to me. I was making a lot more money. And did my gap go away? Just moved, right? In fact, I think it got worse because the stuff I wanted got bigger and more expensive. So the gulf between where I was and where I wanted to be seemed to expand, not shrink. Another example of this, because a lot of times when we're talking about this, people think, yeah, but what about people that have a whole lot of money? And I'm in a business where we get to work with people that have a whole lot of money. And one of my clients who's in his 80s, and I love him to death. He's lived a lot of life, had everything from bankruptcy to massive business success. He's been all over the map. Now he's doing pretty well. We were talking about the gap one day. He's a very good man. I said, do you ever think it goes away? He said, well, let me explain it to you this way. So he pulls over this little model airplane that he has. It's a model jet. which, by the way, is an actual duplicate of the actual jet that he has, right? It's like a $15 million jet, because when you're really rich, you not just have the toy, you have the actual jet to go with it. So he said, see this airplane? He said, I remember when all I wanted was to get this. He said, you know what, God blessed, and things happened, and we were able to get to a position where I felt like we could do it. And so we did. He said, you know what, Wes, I'm so happy that I had this. I'm so grateful for it. But now, the one I really want, and he spins his computer screen around, it's like a $30 million jet on there. He said, so no, I don't think it ever goes away. I think it just moves. He said, the gratefulness I have for where I am doesn't quench the fire in me to want to make it better. And I think that's a real perk up for all of us in the room, because sometimes you can think something's wrong with you, isn't it? I mean, you're running really fast and working hard, and it seems like, well, am I ever going to get to the place where I outrun or out-earn all my ideas? I'll tell you right now, emphatically, no. Because that was never part of the design. One last example, and then we're gonna switch gears a little bit. Because inevitably, somebody will say, yeah, but what about if you're really rich? I mean, I'm talking, what if you were like Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, Saudi oil prince rich, right? I mean, what about, can't they outrun all their ideas? And you know what's great is the Bible actually gives us a great insight to that. Because there was a man who's known as the richest man to ever live. How many of you know who that is? Shout it out. Pastor knew. That's good. That's good that he knew. So, Solomon. Yeah, some of you in the back. That's good. Solomon. And now what the Bible tells us is he was not only the wealthiest man to ever live, but he was also one of the wisest men to ever live. And he was one of the most powerful. Because if you think about this, this was during a time where if you were a king, usually what you did is you planned to go to battle or you were fighting in a battle. He was given peace on every side. So if anyone had the potential and the ability and the resources to be able to outrun all of his ideas, it should have been him. And here's what it goes on, because he actually tried it. In the book of Ecclesiastes, and I recommend that you dig into these scriptures for yourself. I do recommend if you read Ecclesiastes, read the whole thing, because it can get a little depressing if you don't. But he decided he was going to try this out, try to out-earn all his ideas, and arrive at the place where he had finally could have that rest and that margin and that he was looking for. And so he makes an attempt, and it goes on for paragraphs about, I built houses and vineyards. I had servants and singers. I had female servants and male servants and concubines. I had servants born in my house. I built gold-laced statues and pillars, and goes on and on and on. And finally he says, and I hated life. It was vanity. It was like grasping for the wind. It was impossible. Because just like you and just like me, we were built by God, and we have a gap between where we are and where we want to be. And no matter how fast you run, no matter how hard you work, no matter how much you earn, you're never, ever going to have that go away. It's just going to move. So let's close in prayer. No, I'm not going to do that, leave you there. Can't do that, right? Because there's a bright side to that when we can understand it. Because when we can understand it, we can begin to do something that I don't think most people ever do in their life, is that we can redefine rich to God's idea of rich. Because rich is not a noun. Okay, it's not a place we arrive at where we have more money than we have ideas. Rich is an activity that you engage in. It's a verb. So we got to make rich a verb. Being rich is the activity of creating more than you consume. Being rich is the activity of creating more than you consume, right in the middle of your gap between where you are and where you want to be. This has amazing benefits. Okay, when you can begin to see the world through this gap, or this definition of being rich, of creating more than I consume financially, it will enable you to do something that the other definition will never allow you to do. And that's to kick out the thing that prevents most of you from becoming rich and would prevent me from becoming rich. And that's an excuse. And I want you to finish this statement. Okay, when I ask people, what do you feel like standing in between you and really having the kind of wealth and riches that God wants you to have, they answer, I just need more money. Every time, right? So when we begin to think that we can eventually outrun or out-earn all our ideas, money becomes the key driver to us getting there. Now, don't get me wrong. One of my goals is to make more of it every year. Okay, so I'm not against making more money. What I am against is thinking that will solve all the problem. You know what money does? It makes you more of what you already are. Okay, and some of you could tell your own story. You could talk about a time where you were extraordinarily blessed with a large income that came in, and you didn't have the capacity to steward that income, and it went away. Lotto winners are a great example of that, right? You ever Google curse of the lottery, and you'll have about 50 stories that come up about people who were living in a certain means. They got all the wealth they could have ever imagined, and then they were bankrupt, in many cases divorced years later. because we can't allow money to be the thing that we think holds the source of our rest. And if we think that money does what we're ultimately doing, we may not bow down to golden statues, but we will to green pieces of paper with dead presidents, right? And so instead, it enables us to remove money from the source of our rest and put the right person, and that's our God, in that spot. Jesus Christ said it this way in Matthew 11, 28 through 30. He said, "Come to me, all of you who are tired of carrying heavy loads, and I'll give you rest." You know, I'm going to go on to the whole thing, but I really want to stop for a minute here. It's a heavy load when you're trying to outrun and out-earn all your ideas, isn't it? And it's a load that you carry for eternity until you eventually collapse of exhaustion, because you'll never get to the end of those. He didn't wire you that way. And so when we can begin to come to him with all those ideas, with all of my gap, instead of me carrying the heavy load, he says, I'm going to give you rest. He goes on to say, take my yoke upon you, and I'm gentle and humble in spirit, and you'll find rest. Now, what I love about that, for entrepreneurs, this should really perk you up, because anytime I start bringing up God, you go, oh, he's just going to want me to sit on the hammock and pray. I know I can't do any work. You know what? The reality is, the Bible says if man doesn't work, don't let him eat, right? So we're not talking about an absence of activity. What we're talking about is prioritization of that activity in a way that is aligned with what God's priorities are for our life. And what he says is, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon me. When you can yoke up with the priorities that Christ has, he will give you that rest, that extra, that margin, that all of us are really looking for. And it goes on to say that his burden is easy, his load is light. So this isn't an absence of activity. It's a way for you to do the kind of activities that God has originally created and designed you to do. It says before he formed you in your mother's womb, he knew you and he wrote out the days of your life in his book before you ever spent one of them. He's got a great plan and purpose for your life. And so it's many times what keeps us from being rich is not that we're not active. It's that we don't have the right activities, because every idea in your head may be a good idea, but not all God ideas. And so we need that intimacy, that relationship, and that fundamental marination in the presence of God to be able to know which opportunities to seize, which opportunities to delegate, and which ones to leave behind. And so in this core of how do we create more than we consume, it begins by redefining it, by then putting the right person in its place, which is the person of Jesus Christ, knowing that his fundamental priorities for my life and your life are exactly what's going to lead us to that, not only that wonderful progress, but that same place where we can have that rest, that margin, that extra that every one of us is looking for. Now, here's the other thing that this is really beneficial, is it enables you to do something that the other definition never will let you do. And that's prioritize your pursuits. Because I want you to think about this with me for a minute, because I see a lot of people struggle with this. If I believe that the answer to me getting that rest, that margin, that extra that I'm looking for is I just need to run faster and work harder and earn more, eventually I can get to them all, right? Prioritization actually is irrelevant if I believe that, because it denotes that I can eventually get to everything. And so the fact is, we oftentimes in life will go through life with that kind of untold mantra of I just run faster, work harder, I can get to it all. Problem is, that leads to a rhythm of life where I'm pursuing whatever happens to scream the loudest, while sometimes the things that are more important to me get left behind. And it is so critical that we get this, because in my life and your life, I assure you, God burned this on my heart, that the unprioritized pursuit of every opportunity will lead you to poverty as surely as a pursuit of nothing at all. You'll just have to work harder to get there. We can be really busy and really impoverished, right? That's not the goal any of us want. This enables you to step back and yoke up, because a yoke denotes limits, doesn't it? But here's the thing, you're going to live at limits anyway. You're going to either live at the limits of your own capacity, or you can yoke up with God and live at his limits. And guess what? He's able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that I ask, think, or even imagine. And so in our lives, if we can get this one thing, what enables us to do is begin to push money off the throne and put God on that throne and begin to receive his fundamentals. So here's where we go from here. How do we do that? Right? Because there's one thing to talk about. I need to connect with God. I want you to understand one idea. And I think this idea for many of you will be extremely helpful to just take it up a notch. Is I call it the principle of marination. How many cooks do we have in the house? Okay, couple, right? If you've ever cooked, you know that if you've ever had someone cook for you that was good, a lot of times what do they do with the meat? Marinate it, right? And depending on how long they marinate in any environment, it absorbs what it's marinating in. And in our life, if we want to begin to live out of an expression of God, that relationship, that intimacy with Him and His core fundamentals, we need to spend time marinating. And the way we accomplish that, there's tons of ways we can do it. There's don't formula. We overcomplicate things so much, I think, so many times. I mean, God makes it really clear that if we draw near to Him, He's going to draw near to us. It says in Jeremiah that if I call to Him, He'll answer me and show me great and mighty things that I don't know. And so to tap into that, the only thing you have to do is create environments of marination. Now, one of those, which many of you I know already do, is just a daily quiet time with God. Okay, that first thing in the morning where all you're doing is surrendering your ideas and your thoughts and your gap to Him and saying, I know that I never in my own right have the capacity to outrun all these. So not all of them can be your intent for my life. So I'm just going to surrender them to you in my business and with my family and the relationships and my profession. And I want you to just pour into me. And I don't have to understand how it all works for it to work. It's like gravity, right? It's going to work every time. So you marinate in that environment. Another great way is, I call it Automobile University, right? Zig Ziglar made this famous. Alabama University did a study that if you drive just 12,000 miles a year, and most of us do, you're listening to some kind of audio or training CD or cassette, in 2 years' time, you'll get the equivalent of 3 years of college education. And it's amazing. We can learn everything from Spanish all the way to the Bible, right? And so if we can marinate in things that unpack God's fundamentals for our life, in fact, our church even has a podcast that's free, right? That you can go and subscribe to, and you'll get those messages, and it just allow you to marinate. And I remember years ago when Jamie and I first came to know the Lord, what we would do is we had tapes back then. We didn't have the CDs yet, and we would listen to those. And I think the other day we moved, and I had like a box of these old cassettes, and I was going, what do we do with these? So I'm hoping to get my money back. No, I'm just kidding. None of those. But you can marinate. There's tons of good. You can go sign up. We have a free leadership business podcast that you can sign up for. There's also resources that you can purchase that you can put in your car and learn and just marinate in God's presence. So I want to give you a couple tools that we've brought here today. If you're interested in marinating on the things that God has to say about money, because we did write a book, From Busy to Rich. Pastor Rob did the foreword for me. He was gracious enough to do that. Now, here's the interesting thing. We sold out of the books. Okay, so we don't have any here today, but if you buy one, they're $11. We'll ship it to you for free. The other is we do have our audio series of that. So it's a 4-disc audio series, and those generally are $60. We're going to sell them to you today for $50, and we'll also give you the book for free. Again, we'll have to ship that to you. But these are ways where you can marinate in God's presence and in His ideas, His ways of doing and being, and what will begin to happen is He's going to show you that rest. That rest that we all are seeking when we think about being rich, it'll show you how to create more than you consume, not once you get to a destination that doesn't exist, but right where you're at on your way to where you're going. So another way you can marinate, and then I'm gonna wrap this up, is C12. And Tom's in the back there. He's got a little table out there. C12 is an organization for Christian business owners and CEOs. Okay, I've been a part of it personally for about 4 years, and it's basically a once-a-month mastermind. And it has different levels. So if you're just starting out in a business, or if you're a person who has a $1 billion business, there's a slot. And it's a way for you to once a month get away from your business and just think about, am I doing it according to God's will for my life and according to God's will for my business? Because God not only has a lot to say about money, He has a lot to say about business and relationships and every aspect of our lives. So I encourage you, marination. Just begin that process and watch what God can do with when you begin to yoke up with His priorities, because His capacity is unlimited. I want to thank you all, and God bless you. I'll be hanging around after.
Fantastic, Les.